Welcome to the Seeker's Table. I'm your host, Ian White-Marr, and each week I interview a spiritual companion about how contemplative practice can guide us into the sacred mutuality that binds us all together. This is a special episode. It's the first Sunday in our 7-episode series on Lent, where we explore how we can use contemplative practices to open ourselves as we observe the journey through Lent with a particular eye towards justice. My guest today is Therese Taylor Stinson. She is the founding managing member of the Spiritual Directors of Color Network. The SDC network was created after a propitious gathering of 10 spiritual directors of color from across the globe who came together to discuss their concern with the low representation of people of color in contemplative-focused organizations and at the related events. Therese has contributed to or edited 3 publications: Embodied Spirits, Stories of Spiritual Directors of Color; Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Round, Stories of Contemplation and Justice; and finally, Kaleidoscope, Broadening the Palette in the Art of Spiritual Direction. She is also an ordained deacon and ruling elder in the PCUSA, who last served as liaison for Race and Reconciliation on National Capital Presbytery's Mission Coordinating Committee. She served as the 2016 moderator for NCP. Therese is a practicing spiritual director with over 15 years of experience. Therese, thanks for coming on the Seeker's Table. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Ian.
So this is the first Sunday in Lent, and the reading for today sort of places us within Mark. It's the baptism of Jesus. He's baptized by John, and he hears the words, "You are my son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." And then we hear that the Spirit immediately drove him into the wilderness, where he spends 40 days, just like we will in Lent, tempted by the devil, by the adversary, if that's your turn. And then he really is going about his ministry after this. He comes out of the wilderness and into his ministry. And so when you hear this reading, when you sit with this reading as a contemplative, as you go into your meditations, what does the baptism story and the wilderness, and where do you go with all of this?
So I have my own baptism story or stories, which might be a little heretical because I consider that I've been baptized. I actually have physically been baptized more than once. And at least in the Presbyterian Church, and I think in the Roman Catholic Church where I was raised, that yes, baptism would be one time. But I was baptized as an infant at St. Augustine's Catholic Church in Washington, D.C. My grandmother, who was Baptist, converted to Catholicism, and her children were nominally so. When it was time for me to go to school, because my birthday is in November, they would not allow me in public school. I was age 5. I didn't turn 6 until November. And so my mom went to the parish church school that was in the area, Catholic church, and they said they would take me. So I entered first grade 1 month shy of my 6th birthday. And so there was my immersion into Catholicism. And I was baptized when my mom had me. They baptized me at St. Augustine's Church. Nativity is the church where I began going to school. So um, that's a whole long story. So I'll just kind of skip to the place where I finally say to my mother, I've had enough of this Catholic school stuff, and I'd like to go to public school with my friends. And so she eventually went along with it, which might have been a mistake. But anyway, she went along with it. And um, as I go finish high school, as I went to high school, I stopped going to church altogether. And then when I got to college, there were just all kinds of things to learn about Buddhism, consciousness. This would be the early 70s. So there's consciousness thinking and Buddhism and Islam and all of these things. And so I was just exploring many different kinds of ways of being and thinking. Consciousness, a higher consciousness, was another, thing that was going on at the time. And so when I came out of college and went into the work world, eventually I got married. I had a daughter. And because I wanted my daughter to have some kind of container, I ended up back in the church, but not the Catholic church. I went to a non denominational church. And she was maybe about 7 at the time, and she wanted to be baptized. She said she wanted to be baptized, and they baptized by immersion. So at this time, I was coming back to the church myself. I was actually questioning um, Christianity, but trying to find where, how this would suit my own life as well as being a container for my daughter. And anyway, as I was coming back into Christianity, uh, and they were going to baptize my daughter, I decided I wanted to be baptized by immersion, just like Jesus. It was my new beginning. And so I remember the pastor before, which is something that I think Baptist pastors say quite frequently when they're baptizing, that you can go down a dry devil and come up a wet one. so, so anyway, hopefully I didn't come up a wet devil. And at some point, my husband and I moved into our first home. Uh, and I was looking for a church. I was looking in the community for different churches and hadn't found one where my daughter could continue her Christian education. And my neighbor happened to be a member of a church, and it was in August, late August, because church school began generally right after Labor Day. And so she asked me to come to church with her to a spaghetti dinner. This was my first introduction to Presbyterian church. And actually, because I'm from DC, the church was generally in a neighborhood I was familiar with, but I never saw people around that church or anything. It was where I caught the bus to go to work or something. But I was familiar with the church. She asked me to come to this spaghetti dinner. And people came over and started introducing themselves, and I thought I was asking questions about the church school to put my daughter in it. By the time I left there, I was a church school teacher. I hadn't even I hadn't even joined the church yet.
That's some
And
good recruiting.
but they were careful. They had me co-leading with my neighbor, so
Mm-hmm.
they didn't just leave me on my own. But they I was co-leading with my neighbor. So that was my entrance into the Presbyterian church, and now that was like 1984. So however many years, 36 years or so ago, that I joined the Presbyterian church. And it's been a love-hate relationship, but for some, the teaching there has been good for me anyway. But something happened when I first joined the church. I was trying to um, find a way to connect with the people in the community. And so it just so happens one day I go to church, and on the pew there's a little piece of paper that says they're starting up this prayer group. And I've been praying with my grandmother all my life, and in the Catholic Church, you just pray. And so I thought this is someplace maybe where I could, fit in. And so I went to the prayer group and didn't find out until about 6 months or so later that it was a couple that was leading the prayer group, and the husband of the couple had been diagnosed with metastatic cancer and 6 months to live, lung cancer, I think it was, and 6 months to live, which they were telling me this like 6 months or so later. So he'd already, lived past the time they had given him. And he seemed healthy. He was very viable. Um, we kind of got along well, so he ended up asking me to help him lead the prayer group, which was basically we would have some Bible study and then some prayer. And I don't recall so much at first that we were even praying about him, but over the time he began to start to show some symptoms of not being well, and we did start praying for him. And my idea at the time was if we prayed for him, God would answer our prayer. That period. That was it. Well, it took about 2 years, but he did pass away, and I was devastated. I just, what about this faith that, I'm praying and God answers my prayer, and I'm praying for somebody else. And he was such a nice person and helped me to sort of acclimate myself to this new denomination, which I was not at all familiar with. And the other people in the prayer group, perhaps they did this kind of thing all the time, but they didn't seem too disturbed. I mean, they probably figured he was going to die at some point. They didn't seem too disturbed, but it really just shook me up. And also, my grandmother, who I was very close to before I joined that church, had only died maybe a year or so ago. And so I was still kind of grieving my grandmother, in the midst of all of this. And so anyway, that kind of sent me to a place where I think my own contemplative journey became conscious, and it made me question a lot of things about my life, my way of thinking, where I was, and so on. So at any rate, at some point, I joined a committee for women, which was part of National Capital Presbytery, and so one of the things that they used to do was have retreats for women, and so this particular retreat. Um, we all of us that were on the committee for women were helping to facilitate different aspects of the retreat, and so we went through a kind of preparation and training for the retreat. And the pastor who was leading us in this told us to go read Psalm 139, which is my favorite of all the Psalms. And and so she wanted us to go home and read it and find a passage in there that really resonated with us in our story, our life story, and come back and tell it. And so we go home and we read it, and I write, and I like to write anyway, as you probably have already discovered. And I write, and we go back and we're sharing our stories. And when it was my turn to speak and I was sharing my story, I broke down and started crying. And the pastor who was leading our gathering looked at me and said, "Your tears are your baptism." And that struck me so deeply that for me, that's my third baptism.
Wow.
So, fast forward again, because I probably need to hurry up and get through this story. Fast forward again to 2015 when I was installed as first vice moderator, then served as moderator, and then a third year as the outgoing moderator for National Capital Presbytery, as they're planning the installation service, where they usually did communion. They decided that this particular service would be centered around baptism.
Hmm.
And so the person who was planning the event had me write something, uh, one, a liturgy part that had to do, I can't remember if it was a prayer or, sort of a liturgy, but anyway, that had to do with baptism. And so I wrote that. And then instead of us serving communion at the end, we partnered with other people and we baptized the people as they came up to us. We put our hands in the water and gave the sign of the cross like you do at Lent. And so I was doing that. No, if anybody from National Capital Presbytery hears the story, this is the first that they will have heard. That for me, this is another baptism story, you know. and so and so then finally, to make a much longer story short, fast forward a little more, in 2019 I have asthma now, and I had asthma as a child and it's returned, and I was having very bad bout of bronchitis, and had scheduled myself to go to Israel Palestine with the next church, which is part of PCUSA. And I was really sick and saying, I'm really sick. I don't think I can go. But they kept encouraging me that they would be with me, if I needed help or anything. And, I should really try to go. And going to Israel, the Holy Land, was something that I had wanted to do for years and had attempted to many times. And every time something happened that wouldn't allow me to go. So here, now I'm finally getting to go to the Holy Land. And it was always in my head, when I go there, I want to go to the Jordan River and be baptized. And so I don't know what was going on. This was 2019. I don't know exactly what was going on, but unless I'm mistaken, I don't think we ever went to the Jordan River, but we did go to the Sea of Galilee. And I had a younger clergy person who's been a dear friend of mine for a long time. She was on the trip as well. And so I asked her to baptize me in the Sea of Galilee. And there were all these little fish around and everything. And so she was hesitant because you don't have to be baptized but one time to reach. You don't have to
Right.
be baptized anymore. And I guess because she's clergy, it was sort of, not following the rules or something. And so I kept saying, I don't care,
Right.
what the rule is. I'm here in Israel at the Sea of Galilee. I want to be baptized. So she affirmed my baptism. And
Wow.
so how many baptisms was that? About 4 or 5 baptisms. But all of them also represent um, turns, on my contemplative journey, sort of like turns on my contemplative journey, um, turns that brought me deeper into this faith and into my own life experience and how I feel God is using me in my life. So those are my baptisms, my baptism story. And so when you were giving us um, the opportunity to pick a week that we would like to talk about, I said, oh, let's do the baptism because I have lots of baptism stories.
Well, and when I think also about sort of Jesus's baptism, and then like immediately he's called into the desert, right? And I think
Mhm.
about, like what is that thing that happens to us
Mhm.
as we're experiencing, like I personally actually have never been baptized. I was not raised that way. But um, anyways, that's a whole other story. But the process of walking through that ritual, through that threshold of, in the case of Jesus, it's, John the Baptist who's sort of preparing him for this next stage. And then, but even truly the story about your tears as a baptism, like what is it that's sort of happening to us that's, preparing us for this going into the desert? I mean, that actually was the most deserty of the stories, even though in one you were actually kind of in the desert. But
For
with the
real.
yeah, the people who had passed,
Mhm.
and then the sort of, I think some of the times we talk about the temptations of the adversary, as being very physical, but actually, it's so spiritual, the things that
Mhm.
are calling us away.
So when I'm sitting with my directees,
Mm-hmm.
I think it seems like I sit with my directees. They're different people. It comes in different ways, but at some point, I'm always saying how whatever whenever you feel you're at a crossroads or you're being challenged by something or you feel you're having a desert experience, this whole pandemic
Mm-hmm.
presidency
Mm-hmm.
insurrection thing here is a desert.
Right.
It's there. I believe this with my whole heart that it's there to get your attention and you know and I also believe this with my whole heart that the things that grow us or develop us or that get our attention are not just for us. Of course, we want to be better people and have a better life, hopefully, but it's because the things that we learn that get our attention also call us to be a participant in making the world a better place, I believe. And so, all of those baptism stories that I told you were times in my life where there was a turning or a changing. Um, and I've come to it, Teresa of Avila in her book Interior Castle. I read that while I was going through the spiritual guidance program, and there's this spiral staircase going through the middle of the castle, and God is in the center, but there are these floors, and you go up on these floors, and the lower floors, they're demons,
Right.
and it's not until you get to this, I think there's actually 7 levels, and on the seventh level is where you commune with God, you become one with God. And I would ponder that and say, if God is in the center, why aren't we communing with God at every level? And I believe the truth is we are
Hmm.
communing with God at every level. And that though and as I've gone now through my own life and been contemplative about, the experiences that I'm having, I believe that at each level we are always spiraling around the same issue, and at each level we encounter it hopefully at a higher level of consciousness or a deeper level of knowing or being, and so we're always with God. God is always there, but hopefully in that experience we are coming, the words that come to mind are more perfect, but I don't mean perfect, where we're not human, but we become more conscious or thoughtful about our life and why we're here, and hopefully become more willing to be um, part of whatever the reason for all of us being here is, which is to sustain life, I think.
And so, when you are working within the contemplative realm, find, how do you find contemplative practice as supporting what you just said, right? This human life, this human journey that we're on.
Mhm.
Um, why, why is the contemplative path so important for that?
Because if we are discerning and if we're conscious of it, it helps us to uncover some truths or
Mm-hmm.
some about ourselves personally, but also it helps us to see the world, I think, more truthfully. And I think we're here just like the trees, the plants, the animals. Everything is here to sustain life here. And I think that we're here for that purpose as well. And I've heard it said that in the case of human beings, we are the consciousness of the planet. So um, contemplation is one way to enter into that consciousness, so that we can be of use here and help to sustain life here.
So, in this
I
Lent
don't.
journey, mm-hmm, go ahead.
I was just going to say I don't think when I first I think contemplation is a more modern word. I mean, it may have been around for a while, but in terms of spirituality anyway, as I mentioned, going to Catholic school and we were praying all the time, nobody said we were being contemplative. So I think that contemplation is a newer use of the word anyway, because we do reuse words in different ways. So I think a newer use of the word is that it's been connected to spirituality.
Hmm.
Um, but also, I think the way it's still being taught to us, but I think the Spiritual Directors of Color Network has had some influence in kind of changing people's thinking in that way, but it's been thought of as being silent, and maybe doing nothing, you know. And I have read other authors, other writers who would actually push back against that and say, contemplation is connected to action, and so it's not about just sitting around being silent and pondering things and wondering about life. It should lead us to some kind of action, some kind of sacrificial action, that helps sustain life here.
Well, and I think that maps really onto the journey that we're talking about in this Lent. Of course, it's leading us towards Easter, leading us
Hmm.
towards Good Friday, and then Easter. But also this sort of 40 days of sitting with some
Hmm.
period of silence to find out, what is it that we're actually being led towards?
Hmm.
And,
So in in the Catholic Church, we weren't necessarily silent. When I was in school and everything, it was before Vatican II. So,
mhm,
things may have changed somewhat, but it wasn't really about. There was fasting. Certain things were taken out of your diet, or something that you were doing that wasn't healthy, or was not good for you. You decided to put that aside and not do it. But what I think Lent is about, it's about what I've been saying, is it's a time for examination of oneself and one's life and your actions, and why are you here, and what is the purpose for your life here, um, because I don't think, I know Jesus isn't the only one that has died uh, for the betterment of the larger community. So Martin Luther King did. Many people have died for the betterment of their communities, or sacrificed in some way their lives, um, for the betterment of community. So.
well, and I'm sort of drawn to the also like part of what I'm hoping will be reflected on in this Lenten period is the concept of justice as well. And
Hmm.
we're pretty much coming up on this, about a year ago, there was a lot of protest. Black Lives Matter was really starting to be in the streets a lot. It had already been there quite a bit, but with the George Floyd murder, I mean, I wish there were a harder word. Lynching. It was. I mean, he was lynched.
Yeah, they
Really.
they actually do call it a lynching.
Yeah, it was a lynching, and so we sort of, as we sit, I think part of what is this? What is we're really being asked to do as we've been in this COVID period, this desert period. Hopefully, we're coming out maybe 6 months time, something like that. But how do you see, if you do, this Lenten period, this COVID period, this former presidency, new presidency? Like, where are we going?
So
What is
I really
contemplation?
think that now we're here to confront our demons.
Mm,
We need to confront, and I'm not talking about necessarily your particular demons, but the world we're living in, and even if we're not perpetrating the harm, we're sitting back watching it happen, and we're not doing anything about it. And so, I've been thinking this for a while, and I started a festival called the Racial Awareness Festival because I couldn't believe it when we were going through the process of election between when Obama was going out and unfortunately Trump was coming in. But people were saying, I thought we were post-racial, and I was like, what are these people talking about?
Yeah.
Post-racial? Never, never. And so here we are, and it's like all in our face. You can't really avoid it, though. What do we do about it is a little bit more complicated, and I actually believe that this whole process is part of the human condition. I'm not justifying anything. I'm just saying that it's part of the human condition that we form tribes and we everybody doesn't get in, and so in order to make ourselves feel better about who we are, if you're not doing what we're doing, you're not acceptable or whatever. I think this is something that in some form or other has been going on probably since the world began.
Mm-hmm.
And as a matter of fact, we can read some. Well, this is not before the world began, but we can read some of this happening all through the Bible with people even that God loves, like David. So, um, but I think we are at a place, and I also say that this is not a sprint or a marathon; it's a relay race, and that's the way Paul talks about it in the Bible too. That we pick up our baton while we're here, and we try to move it as far as we can, and then we pass it on to the next generation. And you and I may not be able to see it, but I'm hopeful that there will be maybe my grandchildren when they start to come up. Um, there will be a different world, perfect, I don't know, but
Mm-hmm.
different from the one that I've experienced all of my life because I was born just before Brown versus Board of Education, and we've been in a civil rights struggle ever since, as far as I can see. So,
All right. Therese, this has been such a great conversation. I really appreciate it. Thank you for coming on.
thank you for having me.
I hope you found this conversation with Therese Taylor Stinson encouraging and helpful for your journey. You can find out more about her work by visiting the website for the Spiritual Directors of Color at sdcnetwork.org, and I'll put links to the website and to her books in the show notes. And thank you for joining us at the Seeker's Table. You can find all of our interviews on YouTube and wherever you listen to podcasts, as well as in the free resource library on the Seeker's Table website, where I categorize all of the interviews based on theme and keywords. So if you're looking for guidance in a particular area, you can find resources that are related to one another. My name is Ian White Marr, and I hope you'll join me again next week.